Hello and welcome to this lecture about climate change and storytelling. This is based on the book by Anneke Arnold. Those of you who are taking the course in environmental sociology, when you look at the book by Arnold, last name Arnold versus Hannigan, you will note that this book has a clear emphasis on what we could call global heating. Right now I'm calling it global heating because I think it's a mistake to talk about climate change. It would make more sense to talk about global heating. As opposed to Hannigan, Arnold is what we could call a cultural sociologist. This means that parts of the book actually seem more like anthropology than Hannigan's book, which is clearly a sociological book. We can see differences in terms of the background and in relation to how she approaches the subject of sociology, shall we say. And we can see that sometimes in sociology versus anthropology there are certain research questions and methodological choices which are different between the disciplines. So in a sense, Arnold's book is somewhere between sociology and anthropology, and we could call this her a cultural sociologist. And her textbook, which you're using here in this course, instead of viewing it as a traditional textbook, it is actually, in a sense, a series of articles. Some of them extended articles, some of them more extended scientific articles, and they've been put together as a book. And then she has texts which sort of link things together. So it's as if when you're reading each chapter, it's like a long article in a scientific journal. And you should be able to see, as you're reading in the book, a difference and a shift between the books. Anneke Arnold begins her book with a chapter which we can think of as an introduction that sets the stage for the rest of the book, brings up certain things that she otherwise doesn't talk so much about. It's sort of like, okay, I've talked about that, now we can move on from there. Something she is interested in studying and understanding in general is how climate and climate risk is understood and discussed from the perspective of what we could call discourse analysis. Not necessarily discourse analysis of the type that, for example, Foucault talked about and championed. Instead, discourse, because discourse is the conversation which is taking place in society about climate and climate risk. That's what she, in this case, means by discourse. So we can see that parts of the book, or in fact the whole book, take as a point of departure what we can refer to as narrative stories and culture. And a question she asks in the beginning of the book to sort of set the stage, to sort of show the reader, look, I know what I'm talking about. I've looked at what other researchers in this area have been doing. She says, well, how have other researchers dealt with climate and climate risk understood and discussed in society or in groups in society and so forth? And these are questions that have been asked in the past before, and she presents some sort of review and talks about this. How does the general public view climate risks? How does the general public react to it? And in specific, react to the language about uncertainties in the areas of risks and climate. And she can point to there are people who have done that. And she's essentially saying, look, people have done this before, I'm going to be doing something else, or I have done something else. And we can see that for many people in the general public, there is some sort of cognitive dissonance. And the term cognitive dissonance comes from Festinger in the 1950s, or whatever period of time it was. I'm assuming that those of you listening to this, watching this, are familiar with it. I will write a reference to cognitive dissonance in the video description below. And as a result of cognitive dissonance, then many people push aside global heating, climate change, and ignore it. Or in some cases they might approach a small part of the problem, and then push aside the rest. And they might be pushing aside the parts that they feel are beyond their own influence, or there's too much conflict with other matters in life, so that they justify certain things. They justify lack of climate action based on things that they think are beyond their influence, or that it comes into too much conflict with other matters in their life. That they solve this sort of problem in their brains about, I should be doing this, I know this, and so forth, by lifting up the importance of other matters in their life and downplaying, they're sort of fooling themselves, the ramifications of global heating and their role in these activities. It's a way to reduce the cognitive dissonance in their own mind or brain. So these are kinds of items that she brings up early on in her book. She asks, is it that the sum of individual actions is what leads to what society does? Or is there an interaction between core groups of individual actions taken in society and what society does? She asks questions, perhaps questions that might be asked of more of environmental psychologists. Does fear of the ramifications of climate change create or lead to action? And her literature review suggests that it actually rather leads to some sort of a paralysis on a number of people, with or without cognitive distance. Does more knowledge and information lead to action? No. That research shows that some individuals may need help to translate this information into action. And this little cartoon here, we'll look a little closer, is supposed to represent this. What about people that are affected by climate change? That there is some sort of impact, a drought, flooding, whatever it would be, a heat wave, and that their home is not prepared for this, or their place where they're working is not prepared for this. Or if somebody is not affected by climate change, this effect by climate change, does this push someone into getting information about climate change? And she suggests that research says that it's rather difficult to see differences between being affected by climate change or not being affected by climate change that motivates people to get more information about climate change. Comforting lies versus unpleasant truths again. And so I, shall we say, borrowed from Calvin and Hobbes this cartoon here, which we can see can have some sort of relationship here. We'll make it large and take up the whole screen, but for now we see that we read here and then there and then there. And Calvin says, Dad says the sun isn't going out, and this looks like it's, shall they say, late fall going into winter time of year, and we can assume that they're in the northern hemisphere. And he says it's colder because Earth's orbit is taking us farther from the sun. Sounds like it makes a lot of sense. A nice explanation of a parent to a small child. But what the small child says, he says winter will be here soon. Yeah. But the small child has decided the sun is going out. The sun is disappearing or whatever here. And he says, isn't it sad how some people's grip on their lives is so precarious that they'll embrace any preposterous delusion rather than face an occasional bleak truth? Of course, what we see here is that the irony here is that the adult knows what's going on and the child is representing the irrationality here, but is saying something very rational here. So the idea of if we sum up all individual actions on the part of everyone in society, does this become the societal action or the lack of action in society here? And Anthony Giddens has coined the phrase Giddens paradox, and as some people might say, there was a lot of hubris there, that he in his writings noticed something and decided he would name it after himself. It isn't that other people have said in talking about Giddens' work that there was something that Giddens paradox, and Giddens paradox has to do with climate change. And so he lines this up saying that global heating is too abstract and too distant and too invisible in most people's daily life. Of course, if you were, say, I am in December 2024, and so at some point in time, what I'm talking about here won't seem so relevant as new events have occurred since then. If you were living in the southern suburbs of Valencia in the fall of 2024, then it wasn't very abstract or very distant and you're invisible in daily life as the river flooded over. But also if you would have been in 2014 in parts of Pakistan, where approximately, I don't know how much it was, a third or a fourth of the country was impacted by devastating flooding, and years later farmers' fields were still covered in water and couldn't be used, and debris that had come with the flood. So that wasn't very abstract or distant or invisible in daily life. And because of global heating, the effects of being abstract or distant or too invisible in daily life, or the relationship between somebody's consumption patterns and their lack of energy efficiency in their home or whatever it is, that seems very abstract and distant to changes in the atmosphere and global heating as a result. So Giddens suggests that most people will not do all that much because of the abstraction, the distance, and it not being visible in daily life. But then, when the consequences of global heating become visible and are felt, well, then it's too late. And that, in totality, is Giddens' paradox. I suppose if you're... Arnold goes on to talk more about communication and climate risks and understanding on the part of the public and the role of traditional mass media. And she forms of media have taken over the role of being storytellers. Journalism often prides itself on balanced reporting. In schools of journalism, future journalists hear about how you need to have both sides of the story for a fair balance. But looking at climate change, this results, at least during the first years, that journalists may be creating a story about climate change which is not based on mainstream science. Balanced journalism creates a journalistic story for the public which does not match scientific consensus. This leads to the creation of uncertainty among some members of the general public. So just like with astrology or flat earthers, incorrect ideas remained in the minds of some of the populace. And she notes that in some parts of the world that later on, after journalism is creating the journalistic story of there being two sides to climate change, when it becomes clear on the part of the journalists or perhaps the owner of the radio station or the television station or the newspaper, that there is no story of that kind anymore, that there is scientific consensus, and there has been scientific consensus. Now our job is to report faithfully about the scientific consensus. What we can do here is we're not constructing a story, but it's based on how different experts are discussing and are invited to talk about the best way to solve this. Should we be emphasizing industry emissions and transport emissions? Should we be emphasizing diet to reduce the amount of meat? Or should we be doing a bit of both? Or what should we be doing? And so forth. Since climate change is no longer disputed, and therefore it is no longer disputed in journalism, so you can have a debate among natural scientists specializing in atmospheric chemistry and climate change, for example, talking about maybe we should put more of our emphasis on reducing the amount of methane which gets into the atmosphere, because methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas, and obviously we should be doing something about the world petroleum-based economy, fossil fuels, but that's going to take us much longer. So maybe we could reduce methane emissions, and that would be much easier to do. And that would be a discussion which would be reflecting the discussion which is taking place within the natural science community. She then goes on to talk about what she refers to as the deficit model and communication about risk. If we assume for the moment that risk assessments, and this doesn't have to do necessarily with global heating or climate change, but risk assessments about, say, particular chemical substances or radioactivity from nuclear power or whatever. If we assume for the moment that the risk assessment is correct and objective, we'll leave that aside in case there might be some evidence sometimes that it's not entirely objective. But if we assume for the moment that it is, what we discover at the same time is that the perspective and knowledge about these same risks might be incorrect and subjective among large numbers of the general public. A question she asks then is, how can we communicate risk assessment so that the perspective on the part of the general public moves closer to that within science? So if mass media is doing a terrible job of talking about global heating, what could mass media be doing differently? And so she harkens back, she looks back at Giddens' paradox. If the global and the future, looking to the future, even if that future seems to be coming very soon, if it's too abstract and too remote from the everyday life for too many people, and we often think about local and regional matters which are closer in time and space to that, it's much easier for us to relate to that. Of course, we can relate to things that are taking place at a great distance for us because we have relatives that live there, or we have lived there, or we have visited there as a tourist, or we can see connections between what's happening there with things which are much closer in time and space for our everyday life, as a reason why more distant events that we see on a screen could affect us more. But at the same time, it can be difficult to sort of, one, demonstrate scientifically, but also demonstrate in a way that can be easily communicated to the general public that the cause of one particular flooding or one local drought is actually global change. And that's in part because of scientists often being cautious. If we would go back, it's 2024, if we would go back to 2014, if there had been an extreme weather event, most climatologists and most meteorologists would feel very uncomfortable of saying that this is something that clearly is the result of climate change, global heating. Then we had a period of time in the late 2010s and beginning of 2020s, at least in some places in the world, that these same people could be interviewed and they would say, this event is now 20 times more likely to occur because of climate change or global heating. Therefore, we can say with a high degree of confidence that in part this was caused by global heating. Now we can see more recent events in 2024. For example, the flooding outside of and inside of Valencia in eastern Spain. Very quickly after the event, there were meteorologists and climatologists and others very quickly describing how and why this was clearly a result of global heating. Even if similar flooding took place in the Valencia region in the 1950s, I think it was 1957, we'll just say the 1950s. So that means that this kind of flooding has occurred before, but it must be that the likelihood of occurring has increased a lot because of global heating. And indeed, those that have talked about this in detail talk about how the Western Mediterranean Sea, and Valencia borders on the Western Mediterranean Sea, was unusually warm, as much as 4 degrees warmer during the summer and into the fall than it otherwise would be. And this can't be explained any other way than being heated up because of global heating. And when these air masses, warm and full of moisture, moved inland, and some sort of a cold front coming off the Atlantic through the Iberian Peninsula hit that, then the air became suddenly much colder, and we understand that colder air can't hold as much moisture, so obviously there was a tremendous loss of moisture from the air, and it fell to the ground as rain. And so you have something like months of rain falling within a 24-hour period, obviously there's going to be some sort of flooding, and if it had been drought-like conditions before, then the upper surface of the soil cannot absorb so much water, at least to begin with, and so it just all runs downhill. But here we have an example where quickly there are many that said that this can be, it wasn't in the case of small, slow change, it was dramatic, and we can say, yes, this particular flood was caused by global heating. And if this, and we can say that increasingly, in greater likelihood, we will hear more and more saying that this was caused by global heating, which is sort of sounds a bit similar to Giddens' paradox. So, for news organizations, if climate change is sometimes rather subtle, I mean, if we have, say, a place that spring has been coming earlier, instead of spring arriving, and this will be for the northern hemisphere, instead of saying that spring arrives in the middle of April, and now some years spring is arriving in the middle of March, some of us can notice that difference because we pay attention to those kinds of things, and we don't have an objective basis for this, but we have a subjective feeling that spring seems to be coming earlier. How are the news organizations going to show something slow change through time? It would require that the news organization was anticipating that this was going to occur, and that they had already 10 years ago started filming the arrival of birds, migratory birds, and having a dating of that, and then setting up the camera in the same location and say, look, the birds are arriving now, but when we were in the same location 10 years ago, there were no birds arriving, and when the birds are arriving now, we can see that the trees are starting to have leaves come out, but in that period, mid-March before, there were no leaves on any trees at all. We can summarize years of subtle change. That would require much more long-term thinking on the part of news organizations. Another question, but this is something which Arnold doesn't bring up, and that's why it's in another color. And some of you might feel like this is directly directed you. What should we do if we're going to be in Arnold's situation, who's dealing with traditional mass media, evening news reporting and so forth, when there are large numbers of people, usually under the age of 30, who, for older people, it's a big mystery. How do they get information about what's actually happening in society? When they somehow get information from social media and they never are involved in traditional media. Yes, some traditional media have social media outlets and use that, and you might look at that and get a sense of something there. But the social media information might be at most 3 minutes long, whereas the more traditional news media might talk 5 minutes about this, invite in a climate scientist and talk to this person and so forth, and then go on to the next story and so forth, which means that you get a more in-depth explanation, which means that it might be easier for you to understand what's actually happening as opposed to just this very sort of summarized and superficial kind of information that exists in social media. So again, this latter question isn't something which Arnold is talking about. This is something which I have added on here. Something which perhaps could be a solution here, as opposed to talking about global heating a lot in this kind of traditional news setting, maybe traditional mass media should think about what we could call a documentary, that you could have twice a year, a particular documentary, perhaps linked to climate negotiations in time. So you would start this out, and then you would have your reporting about climate negotiations. And you could have a sort of a mini-series where you talk about what has happened during the past year, what will be happening in the future, and so forth, and link in interviews with natural scientists, perhaps link in interviews with sociologists, psychologists, economists, political scientists, and so forth, to give some social science perspectives as well. You give give positive examples about company A thinking that they couldn't do anything about it and discovering that by making this small change they could reduce their emissions by 50% and nobody would notice that. And then they could say, but our big problem now is that we've made this change, so our climate impact is drastically reduced. The problem is that none of the consumers seem to think this is important. And so we're not being rewarded by consumers flocking to us and buying more of our products when they need to buy something like that, which is also a story when it comes to climate change. Now this, and those who are paying a lot of attention will see that the font has changed here, because this is not in Arnold, and this is an observation that I have made during several decades. So I don't just consume the news, I analyze the news, and I sort of pay attention during the long term what's happening or not. So we can see that we have the various Conference of the Party meetings that follow from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and we can see these meetings. Now I don't know how it's reported on by news agencies, or in many cases outside of where I live. I know how it is reported on in printed media such as like The Guardian, but when it comes to television news programs in Sweden, I don't think there's all that much context. When we're going to have reporting on these meetings, they seldom talk about what's been achieved in the past meetings, and what's been achieved and so forth, and what is there left to do. Everything is just sort of taken out of context. Oh, they went over time again, or something like that. And reporters who are on site, wherever the event is taking place, they get a hold of some experts and they interview them, and they tend to rely on what these experts say. And there's no way for the general public to know if this expert, this researcher, has a majority position in this area. Say agriculture and climate change. Say the construction industry, where the manufacturing of cement and concrete is a major, and the use of that in construction is a major emitter of climate change. Do we know if this person who's being interviewed, about their personality, is this person generally an optimistic person or a pessimistic person? How can we interpret what this person is saying based on that? There's no frame of reference. Even if we let the person talk and they're interviewed for 3 or 4 minutes, as opposed to just hearing the person with some sort of sound bite for 30 seconds, we don't have any frame of reference. Could we somehow have more balance in this? Here we have the idea of journalistic balance here. In connections with some meetings, we can hear some politicians who come across as carefully optimistic. I think there was some movement in the negotiations towards the end. I'm positive we will reach agreement here. Yeah, or is that actually what they believe, or is what they're just trying to say so that people at home think that that's the political message that the politician wants to have here? At the same time, we can have activists who are giving a different kind of perspective. We can have researchers who are feeling frustrated. I and my colleagues 15 years ago were screaming out all these things and no one listened, and so forth. And there could be different views about what is needed, or is it enough that we're going to do here? And how will the general public see all of this? And even worse, how will people rely on social media for information? A bad choice many times. Be able to follow this when the more traditional media have difficulty doing this. So, now moving on in Arnold's book, she's going to give us some examples to be more specific about some of these things. She's not talking about mass media or traditional mass media anymore. She's talking about culture in societies and culture in groups and societies, and what is called narration and storytelling. And she's basing this on other researchers' studies, if I understand correctly. And based on this, we can see that in Norway there's some sort of made-up place, say a village with several thousand inhabitants, maybe 10,000 inhabitants, we're ignoring Oslo, Trondheim, and Bergen, the bigger locations, population centers in Norway. And the researchers in these studies were saying, yes, we see that there are many people that we interview, they know something about climate change, but they always think that the climate changes will be in the future. And what do they say when they describe climate change in Norway and their little society where they live in and their personal life? The stories that they tell, they don't necessarily say these exact words, but if you take the interviews, as the researchers did, and try to find what is the story that the people are telling, or different groups of people are saying, and different people tell slightly different stories, but if we put this together, we get one particular story about how a typical Norwegian person seems to view climate change. They know something about climate change, or they say so, but changes will occur in the future. But what are we going to do in the meantime? Oh, we're a little country. What we do does not have much importance. It's not just a country like Norway, you have people saying that. I've run into people in Sweden who say the same thing. And of course, what we do doesn't have that much of importance, ignoring the fact that Norway is a major exporter of oil to other places around the world. It is in fact what is sometimes referred to as a petro-state, although it's not a poor state with a dictator that's taking all the money for the extended family. Another kind of story which is told is, we Norwegians, we were poor for many decades, and only recently do we have a good standard of living in our country. So we deserve what we have now. Nobody should try to take that away from us. We deserve this. So that's a way of defining themselves as that we shouldn't have to make a change. Another part of the story, other countries, mostly the United States, but if this had been more recently, they might have said China. Other places in the world have much greater responsibility compared to us. So an opposing organization, opposing group, an opposing country is created in these people's minds. Those are the guilty party. Don't come and make us feel guilty because we're a little country, it doesn't really matter, we've been poor for a long time, and so forth. And then there's this romantic myth which has been perpetuated in Norwegian society. We Norwegians, we are environmentally friendly because we are close to nature. They would say something like, vi går på tur till hytten min. In other words, we go on hikes up into our cottages up in the mountains and we commune with nature in that period of time and so forth. And they can more recently point to the fact that compared to most other countries in Europe, that Norway has the greatest percentage of electric-powered personal vehicles compared to any other country. So look what we're doing. We're doing something anyway. We're a little country, it doesn't matter all that much, we're doing something anyway. We deserve this. Other countries are the guilty party, and we're close to nature. So don't come to us. So what we can see in this kind of studies, that we can have individuals that are affected by cognitive distance. And society might make an active choice to not do anything or to do very little based on pre-existing frames of reference. Because you can be sure that there are people who are decision makers in Norway that sort of have this idea, and that is a way for them to justify certain kinds of action, or justify inaction, or justify that we will grant more oil drilling permits further north and further out into the Atlantic or wherever it's going to be. So climate change, as we understand it, doesn't fit into the collective picture on society and about that society. And so the narrative about climate change runs into these sort of narratives which exist in society. And since this is the story that people are telling themselves, and the story that some of them have internalized in themselves, then this external story, the climate change story, comes in, goes against and sort of attacks the root of culture. That's why we have Arnold thinking of herself as being a cultural sociologist. So society consists of, among other things, In previous lectures, you've already heard about groups and organizations and institutions and so forth. But Annika Arnold talks a lot more in this part of her book about norms and classifications. And this is the sort of anthropologist in her and others, based on some of the pioneering work of Mary Douglas, who was an anthropologist. That there are certain subjects, certain things in society that are taboo or sins. They don't necessarily have to be sins, but a taboo is something which is morally a problem and we just don't talk about it, or it's a big problem. And we don't talk about it, or we only talk about it in certain acceptable ways. And now I'm going to make a popular culture reference. If we think about the Harry Potter books and Hogwarts and the world of wizardry and so forth, there were those who would say the name Voldemort, but other people would say, "He who must not be mentioned." So Voldemort was a kind of a taboo, was talked about only in certain acceptable ways, because there was a concern almost that if you mentioned the name, you were sort of calling the spirit and you were bringing bad luck on yourself, or you were recalling terrible times that occurred within the wizarding community. If we go away from popular culture, if we go far enough back in time, in Scandinavia, before the Viking Age, when humans had very little dominance over nature, and there were many more wild animals which were much closer to where people were, as opposed to now, where there tend to not be all that many wild animals that can threaten humans, where most humans are. So bears could be very dangerous. The bear could come into your, even though you had some sort of fence around your huts that you had in your little village to keep maybe some animals out where you had gardens and you were growing vegetables, the bear could easily come in. And in some places, and this isn't just the case in, say, Sweden, there were other places in northern and eastern and central Europe that was sort of, bears were not talked about. The word bear was not used because the superstitious people believed that if you used that word too often, it was almost like you were calling on the bear. The bear heard that, and you were waking the spirit to life. So in some places, since many of the bears had brown fur, they were referred to as the brown one or the brown ones, as a way to sort of avoid talking about the bear and bringing the wrath of nature, a bear coming into the village. So you're only allowed to talk about certain things in certain acceptable ways. So we can see this deeply rooted cultural ideas from before industrialization, during the agrarian kind of society and hunter-gatherer societies, and we can see in popular culture something which is taking place approximately now in movies and books, how an evil person's name can't be used or mentioned. Linked to this, when I was talking before about Mary Douglas with taboo and sins, is the idea of something being clean and cleanliness. We in our particular group, we are clean and we deal with cleanliness. Things that we don't want to talk about, or things which are not normal or don't fit into our frame of reference, things that might be taboo, those are dirty. This idea of cleanliness versus something being dirty is something which is a very basic kind of idea in humans and in human societies. So things and ideas and situations that don't fit into our system of classification, those are dirty because we are clean. Something which comes along which is perceived to be against important symbols or breaks borders or rules, these things are dirty and not clean. In Swedish you would say, dessa är orena saker. And we can go back a slide and we can look at the Norwegian situation here. These are the clean narratives spoken about here. And along comes somebody, starts talking about global heating. That is dirty because it doesn't fit into our classification system and our way of viewing ourselves. Anna goes on to talk about, as she refers to it, as group and grid. Everyone is part of some sort of a group. Presumably, everyone is part of some sort of a group. and we in our group affiliation is created, and we are against the others, so to speak. So Arnold in her book talks about the idea of group and grid, and what is meant by that. We become parts of groups, and as more and more people in the group affiliation is also created. And it is we against the others outside of the group. And you could have a subgroup in society which goes along with most things in society but departs from certain things. There are the others in the society. You can have, say, a religious sect in a particular society who reinforce themselves by isolating themselves, but they participate only partially in the rest of society. They are we against the others. And then grid is within a group. How do people behave? What ideas do they have about the world, and which types are permitted? So within a particular group we could have a grid, and that people would fall into, say, 2 or 3 main types, or 3 or 4 main types. If we view about how people view what nature is nature stable? Is nature robust and tolerant? Is nature capricious? What is nature? There's a tendency in many societies that people's views of nature falls into a grid, that they view nature, there's a tendency to view it in general in one of 4 different ways. And that's something which we'll see from the book also. The 4 rationalities, sometimes other researchers say that these are the 4 myths of nature. And there is some sort of scientific evidence for some of this. But we can't say that all nature and all natural phenomena and all ecosystems and all circumstances fall into one of these myths or rationalities. And if you dig a little deeper, you might find, if you reflect yourself on this, you might find that you don't fit neatly into one of those categories. Or maybe you do. Or you might say to yourself, when it comes to these environmental problems, I think is what it is, but when it comes to the others, I'm more here. So you have a somewhat more sophisticated way of viewing nature. Individuals tend to associate themselves with different myths about nature and the world, but also about how society and how society is constructed, and about nature itself, per se, and the relationships between society and nature. And how these myths are distributed within a society can vary through space and time. The myths in a particular society, say in Sweden in 1924 as opposed to 2024 as opposed to 1824, would be different. There could be different myths in a particular place. Let's say we are instead in a country like France, that you could have among city dwellers who think that they're environmentally friendly, that they might have certain myths, and then you could have people that live in the countryside that are actually closer to nature, even if it's an agrarian landscape, that might have different kinds of myths, but they're still in the same general society. This means that they're sort of in different subgroups based on their geographic location and their interactions with something which approaches nature. So we can see that between societies there can be differences, and because of time, I mean, if you go far enough back in time, a given society which is in the same geographic location is a quite different society. As has been sometimes said, the past is a different country. Once you're in a group of some particular kind, there tends to be great pressures in that group to conform to one of the rationalities, one of the part of a grid, because otherwise the person is exhibiting questionable ideas, questionable behavior, and they're behaving they are either dirty or odd, and if they continue to do this and they don't conform to the subtle group pressures, then maybe they'll be ostracized and maybe they'll feel they'll have to leave the group. If we go far enough back in time in a society which was mostly agrarian with lots of small villages, and you couldn't be anonymous, then you were sort of forced to conform to a few sets of ideas. Anything outside of that was that you were dirty or you were odd. If you had some, for that village, odd ideas, maybe you could escape that village and come to a small town where there were enough people that you might find some people that had similar odd ideas, so to speak, and that you could become anonymous enough there that you weren't ostracized out, that you could sort of go under the radar, so to speak, and particularly if you came to a very large city, and a very large city where maybe some traditional ideas were no longer as dominant as they were before. Now, being in a group and this idea of grid, in this case the four rationalities or myths about nature, but we could have other kinds of ideas. This is not necessarily permanent. Besides big long-term societal changes, like with industrialization and so forth, you could have slow shifts on the part of one or more key individuals in a group, and they have sufficient social standing that for them to slowly to not follow all the existing myths and stories, they can get away with that. And they might be able to take certain other people under their wings who would otherwise be ostracized. And it might be possible for, again, here we have this grid with the four rationalities about nature. We could replace that with something else. And that the people that, for one or other reasons, that don't get punished for different kinds of ideas, they could sort of carve out an additional part of a grid or extend the grid, or an existing one of the grids they could maybe divide it in half and be in the other half there. And if this happens long enough, then what was considered a sort of odd idea at some point in time becomes clean and acceptable. But that would be slow change. Of course, there could be a dramatic event which occurs, which calls into question a number of these sort of myths and rationalities that exist in a particular group, in a particular location in society, and that some of these rationalities would quickly get swept away and replaced by something else in the event of a disaster or a scandal or something along those lines. So Arnold continues along here, and then I'm going to ask a question. She asks, to what extent do social relations and group pressures influence how individuals fit into permitted positions, or can there be individual pressures back onto society? In other words, yes, people in a particular group can feel pressured into to sort of feel part of this, but could certain groups that are exerting pressures to these odd ideas among people in that group, could those then cause pressures? Or could the people that left that group themselves, in the actions of leaving that group, if they have sufficient social standing of the right kind, start to make pressures on to the rest of society? And this is a question that you need to think about in relationship to the book itself. Which stories, besides the fictitious town in Norway, could there be? If we turn to table 2.2, we can see examples of research from approximately the first 10 years of this century, approximately the year 2000 to 2010. And we can see there a diversity of stories that researchers have carried out that have been looking about culture and stories about our society and our relationships with nature or particular environmental problems. And this, we can see a diversity of stories and actions or justifications for no action that have been studied. So, moving from an example where we had before about viewing climate change in a made-up small community in Norway, we switch to another part of the world and talking about drought in Australia. What are the kinds of stories that a researcher might find? Here are some possible ideas about what the narratives we might hear that might be told by people in the population. This drought, in other words, based on what thing is happening right now, is nothing special. We've always had dry periods and rainy periods. That is the way of nature. Or possibly in the purple text, this drought, again here and now, is different. The text in green, we've always had droughts through the years, sometimes worse, sometimes not so bad. And then the final, there have been droughts, but the trend is that they're becoming longer and occur more often with powerful storms between the droughts. We see the first two The story begins with a point of departure in what is occurring now and maybe what the person has experienced, where the other ones are more based on having a longer term perspective in creating your story or your understanding of the situation. So, if we sum up how far Arnold has come in her book, and this is about page 43 in the book, she starts out by saying, maybe we should start from culture in a society to better understand how climate changes are perceived, denied, and integrated. And we could swap out the word climate change, the expression, or global heating, and you could add in whatever environmental problem, or maybe something which isn't even interpreted as an environmental problem yet, but still has an environmental dimension in it. So, culture and society might be something we need to have as our starting point for all kinds of environmental problems, she is suggesting. She goes on, the social sciences have together a great number of theories when trying to understand social reactions to climate change. But she's suggesting that maybe we need to have a new discipline in environmental sociology that could focus particularly on global heating. And for this to happen, there would need to be a critical mass of theories and studies that could create this sort of subdiscipline, which doesn't quite exist yet. So there would be a focus on a specific environmental problem with associated problems that arise from global heating. And perhaps we can think of her book as some sort of a contribution in that direction. Then she goes on to talk about communication, and that's a theme which you've heard and we have reasons to perhaps return to here. Because how we communicate is also connected to culture, and communications about problems and ideas and potential solutions forms part of the culture, but is also constrained by pre-consisting parts of culture. She talks about that there is research about climate communication and there is research about climate stories, but this research up until 2018 has largely focused on the audience or the message in the communication or the stories. The storyteller or messenger has frequently been ignored in research. And she's suggesting that that might be something that needs to be researched more. While this is part of her summary, it's also a way to look forward here. If we think about traditional stories that children have been told, but also stories which exist in popular culture, what do we find in these stories? There can be examples of courage, there can be examples of sacrifice. We have main characters doing fantastic things. They are the heroes. Mistakes that are perhaps hopefully forgiven by others in society in the story. We see friendship or dealing with enemies as being a critical part of a number of these stories. And maybe when it comes to climate or global heating, just like Arnold was saying, maybe we need to have a subdiscipline in environmental sociology. Maybe what we need is not climate stories for children. We might need that also, but we might need climate stories for adults. If we look at the Klimatproblematik, in other words, everything dealing with global heating, we could put that together and call that together, the various kinds of problems together, into something which we could call the climate problematic. Usually the stories that we are told are filled with natural science. They're filled with great amounts of complexity. And they're also filled with a certain amount of uncertainty. There's very seldom that any of us hear a very deliberate story crafted with ideas about narrative stories and not full of 1.5 and 2.5 and so forth. Not those kinds of numbers there. we would need these kinds of stories, narrative stories, which are deeply rooted in cultural constructions in a given society, but we don't hear them. Instead, we rely on the natural scientists who are not interested in environmental sociology to tell their stories, and the stories are told in such a way that the general population has difficulty dealing with it, not just that we have cognitive dissonance, for example, but it's just at this very fundamental cultural level, it's very difficult for the listener to receive the story. I think Arnold is on to something here, don't you think? So what about narration and narrative stories? We can switch slides here. A narration is a written, spoken, or visual means of conveying a story to an audience. In other words, in a sense, I am the storyteller, and I use the narration to carry the story to you, the audience. That is at least the metaphor which is being used. Sometimes a narration can be a commentary. In other words, if we think about a film that we may have seen, we see the various events, we see the reactions of the actors. The actors are saying things. We might even have the actor saying something out loud, but we don't see the movement of the mouth. It's supposed to be the person thinking. And then sometimes we have somebody else, an unseen person who's providing commentary and an explanation that sort of bridges us from one part of the story to another. That would also be part of the narrative story. And a narration is a deliberate story. I mean, I could sit down and tell a story without thinking it through. That wouldn't be a narration. A narration is when we have some deliberate thought that goes into how we're going to tell our story. I mean, for a lecture, somebody could just come into the classroom and just say something off the top of their head dealing with the subject, but lectures generally have a deliberate structure in them. It's the same thing with a narrative story. And according to Arnold, she says a narrative story is a form of discourse with a clear order. And the reason why it's discourse is that I'm not having a conversation with words with you or whoever else. The discourse is that with the structure which I'm creating in the story, I'm having some sort of deeper communication with you, and you're not responding, but I am having some sort of a discussion with you. So it's a form of a discourse with a clear order, and there are connections that occur within the various parts of the story to present some sort of a coherent whole. And because of this, you, the listener, you are receptive to this. It creates an order. The story has an order, and it creates an order in you. And if the order works with you, then you're receptive to hear everything that's in the story. And the order which it creates in you fits into an already pre-existing collection of orders and stories that you have, which are your personal ones or part of the culture that you live in. You are familiar with a story, not this one, but somehow it feels familiar. It feels relatable. And this kind of narrative story might be accepted in certain cultures, and we could look within society, there are organizations and there are subgroups and so forth. And to be able to reach people in organizations in their occupational role, or people that are a particular group in society, then the structure of the message, the narration has to be such that it is more likely to be received. And even if there are parts of the message that the person might not like all that much, it will immediately become a bit more palatable because of the storyteller knowing what to do to tell the story. All of that, what I've said here, builds upon the definition which we can find on page 60. Continuing on with narratives. Okay, so there's an order. That means that the narratives have a structure. And the structure obviously is going to have, like most stories, have a start and a middle and an end. Yeah, clearly that's the case. But that's not enough to have a narrative story. That's what many stories have, even ones which are not very well crafted. In a story, events are developed. We have characters that are coming and going. Maybe some of the characters are permanent in the entire story. There's a plot which takes place.
There may be a moral in the story, and the moral may be very clear, or it may not be quite as clear. We may see, looking at the story, that one or more characters have some sort of change in their life, a change in their personality. They may have learned something, or that at the end they're reflecting on what's happened, and then you hear the sort of like the seed, the embryo to them learning something or doing something different based on the story that they participated in. Now, we all, you, me, when we were children, we heard stories. There were parents or other adults or older siblings that told us stories. Some of the stories were read from a book. I was going through some books the other day, and I found this book, Put Me in the Zoo. I got this book when I was 5. It's not any deep kind of story, but it's sort of amusing and probably teaches something to the child. And it was probably one of the first books that I found pleasure in being able to read all by myself, because I can still remember that feeling. So we can see this is something which has sort of stuck with me for a long time, and I recall that taking place. And there was an order to the story, and there were characters, and there was an understanding, and there was a development, and it was a bit amusing. This animal wants to be put in the zoo, and the zookeepers throw him out. We don't want you here. And it turns out the children figure out that this animal should be in the circus. The resolution, problem solved. So there was a particular order in the story which resonated with me and perhaps other children, and something which I still remember to this day, many years later. And we adults, we still have stories. Not that story, but we carry with us stories that we heard when we were very young. And that helps us make sense of the world, even though we're not always thinking about it. What about, I'm going to assume that almost everyone who's hearing this has heard, like, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, Jack and the Beanstalk. There are all kinds of things that happen there. And the child accepts this, and there's a structure to the story, and there are particular kinds of characters that do certain things. And you learn certain lessons, perhaps, or you're at least entertained through the story. We're not going to have Goldilocks and climate change, or Jack and the evil oil company, or something like that. That's not the kind of story I'm talking about there. But it would seem to me that we adults, even though we think we don't have stories, maybe we need some kind of simple stories that help us understand global heating and understand what could be possible and what needs to be done. And as few scientific terms as possible in these stories that would be told. And for that to work, I would suggest that we need to also work with metaphors. And metaphors is not something which Arnold brings up in her book. I mean, she has a particular direction she's moving her book. There was a book, I have the 2003 edition by Lakov and Johnson, called Metaphors We Live By. And they are suggesting that there's a lot more to language than just the words we use. And the metaphors that we live in help form the way we view the world, just the way that Arnold talks about the need for culture. And the book Metaphors We Live By, in my mind, should be part of every multidisciplinary environmental studies program and be used in an environmental communications or an environmental psychology or an environmental sociology course. The book is a bit old, and when you read it and you look at some of the examples, you feel to yourself, oh, some of these examples are very dated to, shall we say, the 1960s and 1970s. My assumption that the authors are very old and retired now, and therefore maybe they don't feel like they're in the position of writing a new version of the book. But something like that could be included in textbooks used in the area of environmental communication, environmental psychology, or environmental sociology. But of course, I can already hear some students saying, no, we don't want to have anything more to read. So there's more to structures and narratives than just start, middle, and end, and the developments and the characters that we see, and that they are and that they have some sort of a development. In Arnold, she speaks about 6 different parts of a typical narrative story. That a narrative story usually contains this, but there can be an emphasis on various parts. And she lists these in order as abstract, orientation, complicating action, evaluation, result or resolution, and then at the end, coda, which is the same as to say the conclusion. And she refers to Labov and Waletsky, who work with formal functional structural analysis, and that's where she's taking this from, that these are the 6 sort of parts in a narrative story, the structures. And on page 66, she shows an example of this. It is part of an interview with somebody, and you can see in the box that you see the order that the story was told, and that's sort of numbered lines there. And then she breaks it down into its constituent parts. And we can find an abstract, an orientation, a complicated action, an evaluation, a result, and a coda. But it doesn't necessarily follow in that exact order chronologically, so to speak. And it could be because the person was being interviewed and didn't have the idea that this person needed to be communicating the structure in an exact order. It could also be that the person was remembering certain things and just saying it in that particular point in time. But we can see that despite it not being exactly in the right chronological order, there is an order in the story, an order which we have some sort of way of relating to. And by able to be related to the order in the story, it's easier for us to entertain the possibility that some of the messages, shall we say, the climate messages and our role and responsibility might be more palatable to us. Arnold goes on, after having Labov and Waletsky with structural linguistics, she gives other examples that could be used in an analysis of narratives. She has Smith, the structural model of genre, and there's a picture on page 71. Then she takes up Jones and Macbeth, narrative policy analysis. And the reason she brings this up is that she needed herself to use this in her study, where she looked at climate advocates in Germany and climate advocates in the United States as part of her research. And Jones and Macbeth are dealing with the loyalty versus ideology on the part of people and organizations. So she talks about the advantages and the disadvantages of using each one of the models. It's very helpful for students that might be interested in using one or more models, either in a particular course or maybe in some sort of a bachelor's thesis or a master's thesis. And for her, for her purposes, she needs to integrate these models. She finds that she needs to include parts of all the models for her study, to be able to solve her research question. And she begins in the chapter by sketching out an integrated model. But she doesn't actually say how she's going to do this practically. If you are an environmental studies student at Malmö University watching this, for the course in environmental sociology, it probably would be enough to use structural linguistics as a basis for your coding, or in conjunction with your coding of written materials or transcribed interviews. But the methods and models that you find in Arnold will have to be the ones that fit in and work and help you answer your research question. And I can't answer which one that would be by just standing here without knowing which research question you have and how you might go about dealing with that. When we come to chapter 4 in the book, then Arnold starts in a very more practical way, shows how she organized her empirical materials in her study based on her integrated model. So if one was going to do a very large kind of study on the caliber of what she did, her work could be a way to sort of copy and follow to some extent, and to the extent that it's helpful for you. And there's a picture which shows the 4 main narrative stories she finds and subcategories of those narratives that she finds when she was interviewing climate advocates in Germany and climate advocates in the United States. Since for students in the environmental studies program, some of you might not be using Arnold at all, and so it doesn't seem like there's any point in me continuing here. And regardless of who you are who is watching this video essay, then I invite you to read more yourself in Arnold to see how she did this, if you think this could be useful for your own work based on what you've heard so far. So let's move towards a summary. We're reaching the end of this video essay here. If we begin thinking about culture and cultural sociology, as Arnold calls it, as our way of viewing environmental sociology and our way of viewing global heating, we see the following, according to Arnold. Communication in traditional media is lacking. And she has suggested how there could be changes in traditional mass media dealing with global heating. We can see some examples based in Norway and based in Australia, where we see frames of reference that are shared in society influence or structure a societal reaction. And there are other examples in the book, but these examples aren't dealt with as thoroughly as the Norwegian example and as the Australian example. Continuing with more summary here, I brought up group and grid. We understand that people are parts of groups. As social animals, we want to be in a social kind of circumstance. We want to be in a group, and we may be in more than one group, but we may identify ourselves primarily with a particular group. But when we're in a group, it's not just that we're in the group, we tend to exclude people and other groups away from our group in our little subgroup. And sometimes this is really extreme, say in a religious sect or similar, where there are strong rules keeping people in the group, and the only way you can come into the group is if you accept certain things. And there's very little room for diversity within the group. And that brings us to grid. That in a group there could be a grid, and that there are a few things which are acceptable. And in general society there could be a few things that are acceptable. And in the book she brings up, shall we call, the 4 myths about nature as examples of a grid. But you could have a grid which doesn't have all that much to do with nature. There could be all kinds of other things that would be considered acceptable ideas, acceptable, say, behavior in society. And when we're in a group, we divide things up. What is permitted in everyday events, activities in life? Which general ideas and action between society and nature are permitted? That which is not permitted is not clean. What are you doing in our group, out from the group? So that means that those who don't conform to at least one of the myths or the stories that is part of this group, which can be sketched out in a grid, you are dirty or strange or deviant. We can look at texts. You can look at texts, and these could be transcribed texts from an interview or transcribed text from a focus group, or you could also be texts which organizations produce, because the text which the organization produces is some sort of communication, and unless the organization is lying, it is at least trying to state the perspective this organization has on society, nature, relationships between society and nature, and this organization's relationship to the rest of society and the rest of nature. And we can find in that stories, and these stories may have structures and patterns, and there may be actions, and there may be roles that are ascribed. The organization takes the role upon itself. The person who is being interviewed, the people in the focus group, etc. We could find narratives, just like Arnold shows examples of her finding narratives in some of her research. Again, I'd like to suggest that the structural linguistics model is probably the easiest to work with. And if you're a student in the environmental sociology course at Malmö University, then that's probably what you want to do, because you have a limited amount of time to carry out your small but interesting study in environmental sociology during the course. There are a few other things that Arnold brings up that could be useful. She brings up the issue attention cycle, and this is actually something which is much more closely linked and comes from political science. But she shows how this idea can be used in environmental sociology studies. Some of you may be familiar with this idea from some other place and not just this course. On page 86, she's been talking about climate advocates before as part of her study, and she uses the term climate advocate as a term which includes those who work with climate issues. And the climate advocate could be in a company, the climate advocate could be in a university, the climate advocate could be in a non-governmental organizations or in government. There could be climate advocates that exist in various places in society, and they may be collaborating with each other informally. And the stories that she gets from interviewing the various kinds of climate advocates, and she can clearly do an interview